You're listening or watching TV Club, and for the next half an hour, we're going to be talking about Ted Lasso, so you don't have to. Hi, I'm JR.
Hi, I'm Matt.
I'm Simon.
So, Ted Lasso, Series 2, Season 2, I suppose, if it's an American thing, has just finished. So, we thought we'd have a conversation about Ted Lasso, because I don't think any of us saw the first season as it went out, but we've all caught up in the meantime. Because Apple TV have been throwing out lots of, free trials and stuff and various other things. I suppose it's a series that happened at the right time because that first season came out about, if I'm not remembering wrong, the first season came out during the first lockdown, or certainly during that sort of first few months of the pandemic, when everybody was scrabbling around for things to watch. And a lot of people were scrabbling around. I mean, certain things like that program about the wild animal hunter or something got a lot of traction very early on. But actually, once things settled down, what people wanted was something maybe a bit more gentle and reassuring, really. And so Ted Lasso just, I suppose, by pure coincidence, happened to turn up at exactly the right time. So I guess we've all, as I say, come to the first season late and then basically watched the second season with broadcast. What were we expecting? Because there'd already been quite a lot of chatter about Ted Lasso before any of us started watching it. Simon, what were you expecting from Ted Lasso when you started watching? Were you reluctant to start watching it because of what you'd heard, or did that make you want to watch it all the more?
I was reluctant in as much as it was based around the idea of a football team. Because it's just not my, excuse the joke, field. You expect certain things, and I didn't really know what to expect. I hadn't read an awful lot, just that people were absolutely raving about it. And I was looking through the lineup of stuff that you could watch on Apple TV, and then just we just thought we'd try it, myself and my wife. But the nicest thing was the fact that we both started watching together. So
yeah,
and that was really good. Actually, no, having said that, I think I watched the first episode and then said, no, you need to watch it, and sat down and watched the first episode with her again, and then we absolutely binged that first season. We were snapped.
I think I had mentioned it to you just before you started. Maybe I could be misremembering.
I think it was coming up in conversation between you and Matt. That's right. And so it probably flagged up in my head. And when I saw it there, I thought, I'll give that a go and see what it's all about.
What did you expect, Matt? Because as far as I'm aware, you're not really a big football fan either, are you?
No. So like Simon, I didn't leap on this because it was not just because it was about football, but it's an American taking on a British football club, which there have been sort of films of that, so it's kind of a well-trodden idea, but gradually it was just word of mouth. Gradually you hear that actually this is something special. This is not more than a sitcom, but this has a sort of tone that makes it particularly watchable. And I knew Brett Goldstein as well from the podcasts. So he does a podcast. So I was familiar with Brett Goldstein, and he'd been talking about it. And his guests started being on his show because he was suddenly very popular with Ted Lasso, and they started talking about it. So eventually it was just, crowd pressure forced me into it.
I guess what I was expecting, the way people were talking about it, I guess I was kind of expecting something of a throwback type sitcom. But then when you think of a sort of throwback type sitcom, maybe you're also thinking of Mrs. Brown's Boys, because Mrs. Brown's Boys, apart from the language and some of the content, is very much in the style of a lot of 1970s comedies. I think Mrs. Brown's Boys is basically very similar to something like, I don't know, Are You Being Served, for example, really. And I think I kind of half expected something that was tonally similar to that, maybe sort of milder and gentler and more sentimental, perhaps. So what did we think of what we got? Because I think what I got was probably kind of what I expected, but perhaps also a very different spin, so that I kind of got what I expected, but not what I expected at the same time, if you know what I mean. Matt, what were your initial impressions of it?
I was surprised by it, because the format, the story suggests it's going to go in a particular direction. If an American takes on a British football club, you're expecting sort of antagonism and friction and the American kind of steaming in. But it sort of flips that on its head, which was surprising. So the actual character of Ted Lasso was completely unexpected for me. I wasn't expecting that, and that's really the center of the whole thing, because everybody in the series is acting like he should be the other. He should be the cliche, but actually he's constantly puncturing that, and the comedy's constantly puncturing that. So yeah, I mean, it's a surprise all the way through and really appealing.
Simon, what about you?
I think it was the modesty in the character of Ted Lasso. You expect him to come in like a bull in a china shop, shouting the odds of how they're going to do everything. But there's some instant modesty and warmth from the character where there's no abrasion with him. He's instantly everyone's friend, and you kind of expect to be irritated by him, but actually you find yourself warming to him, and that happens quite quickly. Because I don't think I would have lasted if he'd gone through a whole episode being quite bombastic. Then I don't know whether I would have come back for the second episode or not. But
There are
I think it was.
there are two things that happen in that first series that really sort of undermine what your expectations might have been if you were expecting it to be a bullish American. And one is that first series kind of concentrates on the failures more than the successes. So the first series kind of has a downwards trajectory in terms of how everybody's doing. And they make the character, Ted Lasso, this character who's not had big success in America. So the reason they've imported him is because he's not this big superstar coach in America. He's had one success in a sort of lower ranking team. So he's never known big success. And so he's brought over purely because he's not going to be the bullish manager. And then the other thing, of course, is that they give him frailties in his personal life too. And so throughout that first series, Ted Lasso is this really genial character who's got all these sort of dark things happening in the sort of background of his life, and whose current trajectory of life isn't on an upward path either. And so it's not one of the, because it kind of the expectation you have going in is that this guy's going to turn up and he's going to turn things around and everything's going to be great, and it's going to be a story about successes and successes essentially, while the comedy is going to come out of the characters. And you kind of wonder, well, what can they do with that? So instead they invert everything that you might expect if those are the things that you kind of got in the back of your mind going in, Matt.
And actually, I think it's even cleverer than that, because actually, one potential expectation is it's going to be failure after failure, unremittingly. And what Simon said was he felt that there was a risk that he would dislike this character after a time because he's so nice and so not sentimental, but kind of empathetic and sweet. And I think there's a recent strain of comedy with likable characters. It's much harder, I think, to make likable characters in a comedy than it is to make unlikable characters. So Ricky Gervais has made a career of making unlikable characters in comedy, and you know, they're quite, I'm not a massive fan, but they're quite funny. But I think that's easier than things like The Detectorists, Ted Lasso, Ghosts, where these are characters you want to spend time with, but there's also comedy in them in there. So if Ricky Gervais was making Ted Lasso, the football team would go into like the Yeovil Town leagues or the really bottom leagues, and it would be an unpleasant character, and most of the other characters would be unpleasant, and there'd be one player who's the kind of the audience figure who sort of recognizes what's happening. And I was really glad that it didn't do that, because I think at the moment there's a strain of comedy with a kind of a good-natured strain of comedy with likable characters, and kind of and that way they can get messages out of it, particularly in the second season of Ted Lasso. you get quite a lot about anxiety and pressure and relationships, which, I mean, they're not like, it's not a self-help manual, but it's kind of quite important, strong messages, and they only work because of the tone of the series and the sort of the authentic feel of it.
Yeah, there's a really nice bit in the very last episode of the second season where he sits down in front of the gathered press and says, let's talk about mental health issues in sports. And then it cuts away. So they don't have the conversation. They don't preach to you about the issue. But what they do is they bring the issue up, say it's a conversation that needs to be had, and leave it there. Because one of the complaints...
And sorry.
Go on, yeah. No, it's all right. Go on.
And they can do that because they've already had that conversation through the comedy, through the season. Yeah. So in every episode, there's been some sort of... They've studied one side of mental health.
Well, there's a sort of team psychiatrist throughout the second season, and apparently she's going to be still around in the third season too, from what I've just read. So that's...
There's a constant feeling that they don't play the easy hand with any of this. Like Matt was saying, they could have done the Ricky Gervais direction of, getting the cringe radar going, and that's an uncomfortable thing. And I don't know if it's always... There's this disbelief thing where you're watching and go, oh my God, I can't believe they're doing that. And there are points...
don't like that kind of stuff.
No. And there are points in this series, particularly to do with relationships, where you feel like it's steering one way and you think, oh no, please don't go down that way, because we like these characters. I mean, it's got a lot to do with the fact that we do invest an awful lot of emotion in these characters. You become attached to them, and you feel like it's steering down one way where another series would have done an RTD and twisted the knife and said, oh no, I'm going to take you down there, where you're thinking, no, please don't do that, and they don't, and they talk about it, and they do mature things, and the characters learn from their mistakes. A lot of these characters, like Roy Kent, has learnt, he's finding himself in a healthy relationship, whereas previously, before that, he'd had obviously had a string of unhealthy relationships where he felt vulnerable. Then he suddenly finds himself in a happy relationship, and you literally see the clogs whirring, the cogs whirring, and he's thinking about, hang on, I don't need to feel like that anymore, therefore I can stop being angry, and this is the way we're going. And then particularly towards the end of the second season, the fact that they're able to put in these little scenes with weeks, if not months apart, just sort of saying, well, this happens, but they get over it, and this happens and they get over it. But meanwhile, there's other stuff going on, negative stuff, which I'm sure we'll touch on later. But I was going to say, when at the beginning of the podcast, you started talking about old comedy series, I think the nearest this is to something like a vintage comedy is probably Dad's Army, because you literally have that array of every character is there for a reason, and every character is fully fleshed out and behaves in a consistent manner.
I was absolutely thinking of Dad's Army.
Yeah.
To this.
Do you know the other thing that this is very similar to, really, and it's so obvious it barely needs saying, and yet I don't suppose a lot of people will have thought it, because at the same time it feels like it's the antithesis of that thing, but Footballers' Wives. Did either of you watch any of that?
No.
That was very similar, but darker, but with its tongue very much in its cheek. So actually it wasn't as dark as it kind of felt. So actually Footballers' Wives was kind of a loving homage in a British sense to sort of American soap operas of the 70s and 80s.
Wasn't Anna Waddingham in that? I seem to remember my wife saying that. Or...
It's possible. Yeah, very much possible. I don't know. I've not checked it out. But yeah, she's certainly exactly the kind of person who would have been in that. And it was a very similar setup. Footballers' Wives wasn't really about the football. It wasn't really about the footballers' wives. It was about the relationships between the footballers and the footballers' wives, and the management structure and everything else, the press and so on and so forth. The setup was incredibly similar, really, and it just took a slightly different angle on it. But in the end, I don't think Footballers' Wives was as nasty as some of the press made out. I think it was actually kind of a like I say, like a loving homage. And I don't think this is that dissimilar from that. I think the first series of this does one thing, and I'm not talking about the team getting relegated, that sort of trajectory. The first series of this, I think, sets up the characters so that they're people you can love and empathize with and care about. And it keeps it relatively simple. So when there are issues in the first series, they tend to be Nate can't get his parents into a restaurant. So, that's, oh, in fact, I'm not even sure if that was in the first series, but in the second. But you know
The
what I mean?
second.
Yeah, that's the kind of storyline I think that was coming up more often in the first series. And sort of off the back of that, there were a few sort of switch arounds in relationships. So Hannah Waddingham's character, Rebecca, we see what happens between her and her husband. We see what happens between Ted Lasso and his wife. We see what happens between Juno Temple's character and the two footballers. Everything in the first series seems to be there to set up for what comes afterwards. And the second series feels to me, the second series is where they start telling the story. Did either of you feel the same way about it? Like the first series was prologue, and then the second series is really where it starts?
I think the first series was self-contained. I think it now looks like it ended on a cliffhanger, but I think that was intended to be where it could end.
Yes.
But obviously, it's only after the reaction to the first series they realised that actually they're not just going to get a second; they're going to get a third. So, like most of these things, the second series is where the ongoing story starts
to kick in,
and you can see exactly what's going to happen in this. Well, you can't see exactly what's going to happen in the third, but you can imagine where the third series is going to go. So yeah, I think it's a sign of confidence with the second series.
I wasn't so keen, I have to say, on some of the things that were coming up in the second series, which is not to say that I didn't think they didn't deserve to be there and that they didn't work, but I really enjoyed the lightness of the first series. And sometimes with these things, when it starts to introduce more ongoing storylines, I tend to feel it starts bogging itself down. And I'll give you an example of something that's not related to that, but that is related to that I thought was quite telling. In the first series, almost every episode is between 31 and 33 minutes. In the second series, a lot of the episodes are 40 minutes, 45 minutes. The last one's 49. They've got so many things going on, they can't contain it within the length. And one of the good things about streaming is that you're not confined by advertising space and broadcast schedules, so episodes can be as long as they need to be. But one of the bad things about it is there's another reason why episodes of certain types of program are the length they are, and that's because that type of program suits that amount of space. Your brain, if it's looking at a sitcom, your brain kind of says, well, that's about half an hour's worth of material. And I've got to say, in some of those episodes in the second series of this, when they started going on for 40, 45, I didn't tire of watching them because I enjoyed being in the company of the characters. But there was a part of me that was feeling that it was too stuffed, that there was too much going on, and that I'd rather maybe they'd split it into 15 or 16 episodes and just space things out a little bit more evenly. Did either of you two, what were your feelings about the second series as opposed to the first series in terms of where the story went and what the tone was like? Simon?
It certainly felt like it was stretching its arms out a bit and thinking we've got the space to do this now, that we can tell the story that we need to in the amount of time, and it still feels very I don't know what the word is. Trim, is that the right word? In as much, I don't think there's much in the way of filler at all.
No.
It feels like a very comfortable, one of those, what you want from a series where you feel like you want more. You get to the end of an episode and you literally take your breath and go, that was, I would like more, but I don't think I could have taken more of that. That was absolutely perfect. So, but I think the shape of the episodes in season 2 seemed to change a little bit. And you had that single, that kind of bottle episode of Beard. Was something completely different. And
his eyes wide shut episode.
that was interesting in as much as it wasn't laugh heavy at all. I think it took me about 3/4 of the way through before I started finding anything funny, or any as funny as the rest of the series. But then you realise that it's this emotional story that's being told. So that's the clever thing. I mean that's the thing with these characters. When we first met them in season 1, they're all in almost like a seesaw position where you're not quite sure which way the character's going to go, because you have your preconceptions about Ted, that he's this bombastic American turning up and he's going to make everything right. And you don't know whether, and then you've got Beard, who's, you know, supposedly grumpy or very quiet or grumpy, and then you find out it's because he's very measured and he's a deep thinker, and when he says something, he only speaks when he needs to. One of those sort of characters. All of them, Keeley. Keeley is supposedly shallow and is of a particular type, a bit of a bimbo and that sort of thing, and we get to the end of season 2 and we see it's completely the opposite. Every single character has kind of got that thing where you're not quite sure which way they'll go. And for me, as somebody who has never really warmed to football, I've found things to love in it and found things to enjoy in it from time to time. But there's always a certain mistrust, from personal experience of being at school and being the last to be picked in the team and all that rubbish that shouldn't matter. It did matter. And so I have preconceptions of how sportsmen are and how footballers are. But again, every single person in that team is suddenly shows these incredible personalities. I mean, I don't know how realistic that is. I don't know as if you're going to find that in your typical football team. But what you do find is that the relationships build between these people.
Yeah, I've got to say, I think most football teams, you probably would find that, to be honest, because we look at them on the telly and we see them when the camera's pointing at them and they're as uncomfortable as hell, and they have to do an interview 2 minutes after they've finished playing 90 minutes or so of football, and it's the last thing they want to be doing. And we think, well, they're just thickos. And the truth is, footballers are human beings just like the rest of us. So, of course, the dressing rooms are like the dressing rooms we have here. Of course they are. Maybe not, quite the heightened way with all the comedy that we have here. But of course, those are, 10 or 15 human beings in a dressing room rather than 10 or 15 cardboard cutouts like we probably tend to categorize them.
As testified, by the likes of Marcus Rashford, that somebody like that can come out of this situation. Quite incredible.
Matt, what were your feelings about Series 2 versus Series 1?
It didn't have the surprise that Series 1 had.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
I didn't find that to be too much of a problem, because after Series 1, I wanted to spend more time with these people. I think it did move. I think Series 1 was definitely a sitcom. A sitcom. It was, and I think after that success, the success was so great that obviously they're now transitioning it into a comedy drama, so a more prestige comedy drama. And I think it's successful in what they do. I think it does translate well. I mean, it is basically a different format. I found it a bit strange having a Christmas special in the middle of August. And there must have been there must have been a reason. There must have been a plan to have a Christmas special, and they just decided to release it. I mean, they can't release it after the series because it's an ongoing story. So
yeah, I think maybe they just decided to do a Christmas episode so that there could be a Ted Lasso Christmas episode in the canon.
Yes,
maybe.
Yeah, but they would get a Christmas episode. I mean, it might be a pandemic thing as well. Maybe they just
television especially on streaming, works slightly differently, doesn't it? Yeah. So I don't know whether there would be a Christmas episode or not.
Having said that, that was my favorite. That did have my favorite bits in it. So the Roy Kent testing his niece for halitosis is possibly my favorite bit in the whole series, and Brett Goldstein's facial expression.
Yes,
he's really good. So I did like the second series, but in a different way to the first. I think
at the risk of
the right length.
Yeah, speaking of the right length, let's not overstretch ourselves, because we said we'd do this, relatively briefly, half an hour. Should we choose a favourite character? Maybe for myself, I think Rebecca, Hannah Waddingham. I think she's amazing, really. The stuff that she gets to do as an actress in that part, I think, is astonishing. I don't think necessarily she's my favorite character, but I think of all the actors and the characters they play in it, she's probably the one that's impressed me the most. Everything from her fragility at times to her singing voice, which when she does the singing a couple of times, the two episodes in which she has to sing, and I'm not going to spoil it for anybody who's not seen it yet, what those episodes are, because one of them just basically takes your breath away, really. I think she's amazing. So she, for me, is the big surprise, I suppose. Matt, is there someone for you who stands out?
Yeah, it's Brett Goldstein, and it's the fact that he doesn't have that much dialogue, but he is the kind of most empathetic next to Lasso himself. He's the most empathetic, and he's actually a really thoughtful character, and you can see those thoughts playing across his face. There are a few moments where he suddenly realizes what's going on, or he realizes what he's done wrong, and he just sort of recalculates in his head and then swears profoundly and then storms off really angry at
And the
having had this
relationship,
revelation.
yeah,
And
his relationship with Jamie Tart is coming along nicely, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's I mean, that's not just testament to Brett Goldstein, but he's Brett Goldstein's written. That's Brett Goldstein's written character.
Yeah.
So I think he's the revelation.
In fact, one of the decent things about it is that despite the fact that there's not really an awful lot of football in it at all, and that they have taken shortcuts in presenting the football, so some of it's not, strictly speaking, quite realistic, but actually the general sense of what they're doing very much feels like it's been overseen by somebody who knows what they're talking about. And when you consider that the sort of upper ends of the executive producership of this program are all Americans, that's quite an achievement. And in fact, I don't know, do either of you remember Scrubs? Because this is from Bill Lawrence, who was the creator of Scrubs. So this shares a lot of DNA with Scrubs, and I think you can sort of feel that too. But Simon, a character, and obviously you were going to say Brett Goldstein. So is there someone other than Brett Goldstein who stands out for you, maybe?
The only thing I would say just briefly about Brett Goldstein is that it's the vulnerability that he brings to that character that makes him literally sex on legs. I honestly say that as a heterosexual man, that I just adore the ground that character walks on.
I think they all do that, though. I think that's one of the sort of standards across the series, is that they all, even down to the sort of smaller cameo. So a lot of the footballers, the guys who play the footballers, don't really get an awful lot to do, and yet most of them have had occasion to show their more vulnerable side during the course of the series, haven't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Jeremy Swift as Leslie, I just think is amazing, and I think that's the part he's been waiting for his whole life. Well, that's how I feel, because he's one of those actors who you see in lots of other things, and suddenly he really, really does shine. But I think seeing as we're going to wrap this up fairly quickly, I think Nate as a character is just amazing. And in as much as we get these characters who we think maybe we won't like at the start, we end up falling in love with, we've got the opposing journey going on with him. I mean, the only constant character, the only character in the whole thing that doesn't change through the whole thing is Rupert, who is, because he's just consistently a bit of a snake, and he's this. And you see him talking, to one side and whispering in Nate's ear and what have you. And for some reason, it brought to mind the Phantom Menace. It made me think of Star Wars prequels, that Rupert is the Emperor and Nate is Anakin Skywalker, that he's the one who's being poisoned through his own insecurities. And psychologically, this is an incredible program. Amazing that these are real emotions and real reactions and real, the choices that people make. That Nate has choices he can make, and he's taking the wrong ones, and this is what's bringing the show forward. And off the back of that, very quickly, I know I'm mentioning three now, but Sharon, Sarah Niles as the Doctor.
She's great, yeah.
She's wonderful. She is really wonderful. Again, a really understated performance, but in that, a really believable performance. So this is all so believable. There's nothing particularly far-fetched about this at all. Yeah, I mean, you've created a football club where all this amazing stuff happens, like footballers get offers from, the other side of the world to come and play for them and things like that. But
There's nothing unrealistic about that, though. Let's be honest.
no, okay, yeah. See, there's a world I know very little about. Yeah, you're right. I don't think there's a weak character in the whole thing. I really don't.
On that note, then, unless you've anything you want to add, Matt.
No.
Oh, in which case, then, Ted Lasso, we will continue to watch its progress with pleasure, I guess. I was JR.
I was Matt.
I was Simon.
And we will speak again soon.